The major problem with Total War, as I see it, is that CA hasn't invested enough time in the engine and tools, so it's clunky as hell to work with, so implementing anything is more cumbersome than it should be, and that's going to make it less likely that people will try big changes. Many don't realise it, but the CA brand team are the ones that dictate what gets made. They're the ones with the purse strings, the ones doing the pitches to Sega to secure funding. Warhammer 3 now limps on with all this legacy, making any updates, new content or bug fixes extremely difficult to produce. Before 2023, I had a few one-off conversations with former and current Creative Assembly developers. Usually they got in contact with me because they had developed an interest in my critiques, and their motive for contacting me was to inform me that they secretly agreed with me, briefly offer some encouragement to keep going, and maybe even tell an anecdote or two that let me see for myself that I was on the right track with what I was saying. These conversations were usually one-offs, and I was always reluctant to openly deploy anything from them in support of, say, further critique videos, mostly for fear of compromising them. Likewise, if I had agreed I wouldn't repeat anything they told me, then I simply wouldn't. I was always grateful that they were even talking to me. If someone comes to me at personal risk to themselves to offer encouragement and help me out, the last thing I'm going to do is impetuously deploy what they say and cause problems for them. It's especially imprudent if doing so isn't even guaranteed to be decisive and has basically no hope of bringing about major change or improvement. Also, I'm likewise not going to make a big deal out of something that I can't corroborate at all and risk looking like a complete twat that hasn't done my homework, that has egg on my face, and be humiliated forever. Things have changed a lot over the course of 2023 though. A lot. Scandal after scandal has sent the community into a frenzy. First of all, you have the Redditors and the Discordites snap out of their normal fanboy consumer trance, mostly thanks to an outrageous price hike that was the final straw following 18 months of non-stop shit for all the DLC dummy sucker crowd. They finally had enough. The frog was thoroughly boiled and it hopped out anyway, and has been absolutely trashing the place ever since. In addition, even the spineless brown-noser YouTubers that previously were shilling around the clock and sucking boot for CA have been flocking like lemmings in the complete opposite direction, forced by their peers, their commenters, the wind, and the algorithm on the whole, to adopt a more recalcitrant attitude towards CA and Total War, for fear of losing all perception of credibility, in many cases not realising that they never even had any to begin with.
I'm not questioning your honour. I'm denying its existence.
I've been told that plenty of YouTubers are even just ignoring CA at this point, that they're losing grip on the content creator program. I'll leave it up to the viewer to decide where to draw the line on who's a shill and who isn't. I've pretty much always just spotlighted and laughed at the obvious ones when they do all the work in outing themselves. This is a problem with being a shill and also wanting respect. Sometimes you shill so hard that you have to demand respect so obviously that people spot it and it looks ridiculous. And finally, in the aftermath of the outright cancellation of Hyenas and subsequent mass firings of staff, many developers themselves have apparently now had enough of all of this and are speaking to me and telling me anything I want to know. There's open rebellion from all quarters.
Ava Huang says, Total War is right, I would never work for CA again. They refused to give us any decent bonuses or raises, while some of the manager got 20,000 as a Christmas bonus last year.
And it isn't just Hyenas developers that came to me, that is, the console team. I also had staff working only on Total War come to me, that is, people from the main team. I also had staff from CA Sofia appearing. I had people that worked at CA for over a decade appear. I had people that were only there for a year. I had current CA, I had former CA, I had QA people, I had higher-ups like directors. Some came to me angrily with loads of detail. Some came to me calmly and gave brief, tempered, grounded, sobering descriptions. I had one that told me they used to watch my hardcore Shogun 2 runs back in 2014. I had people come to me who joined CA to work on only one game and then left as soon as it shipped. What they all had in common though is that they were all really nice and they were all telling the truth. I quickly noticed repetitions of the same problems in different words. There was remarkable concordance throughout. So here's what they said about Total War. Here is Total War in 2023 from the developers themselves. Who better to tell it? Let's start at the beginning. One of the first devs to get in touch with me was about a year ago. Let's call them Augustus. And I should mention, I was really delighted to hear from them. It was really validating. I asked Augustus, to paraphrase, What happened after Fall of the Samurai to make Rome 2 so bad? What went so wrong between Fall of the Samurai and Rome 2? What went so wrong with Total War in general? And Augustus described three main things. One, a big change in personnel. For example, the original talent isn't there anymore, it's not the same company. Two, an increase in reliance on DLC. Guys got split from the main team to form a DLC team, where they would essentially be churning out reskins of old shit to peddle money for old rope. And number three, a tech debt problem. The codebase is creaking at the seams, so much tech debt accumulated and no time to fix it. This isn't an excuse, the time should have been made. I mostly just sat on all of this for the past year. The vivid descriptions of the tech debt problem were particularly memorable and I kept them in mind and waited for confirmation. It didn't help that Warhammer 3 had just been another Rome 2 style launch, and in the midst of the shit show, CEA had already said this. A quote from the article: "Making a change to one area of code, to the systems that make the game run or ensure that other code runs properly, can have a ripple effect into those other systems and mechanics. Think of it like trying to remove a single stick from the middle of a pile of sticks without moving them. It's often difficult, if not impossible." So we had CA acknowledging the problem in official statements as part of damage control while the fanbase was rioting, and one of the first developers willing to go into detail about the behind the scenes was telling me the exact same stuff. Just keep this in mind. Anyway, this brings us to the current Hyena scandal. One of the first Total War developers to get in touch with me after that was, let's call them Julius. I immediately asked Julius what was running Total War into the ground. Julius answered, "Many don't realise it, but the CA brand team are the ones that dictate what gets made. They're the ones with the purse strings, the ones doing the pitches to Sega to secure funding." So I followed up, "This brand department dominance, is this a recent thing since Warhammer?" And Julius went on, "It's always been that way, even for Rome 2. The brand team, has far too much power, and they've now exalted Rob to director, so he's untouchable. Within brand, you have brand management, of which there's a lead for fantasy and historical. They make the PowerPoint decks that define what the game is, the vision, the life cycle, and the budget." And this is the big question. Every Total War YouTuber has to ask any CA developer when they realise they're both on the same page. So a bit of conversing later, I asked Julius straight what would they say if they were in my position and had my captive audience and wanted to use it to fix Total War. The answer was meant for my benefit, but it's too good to keep to myself. So Julius answered, "It's certainly the big question, isn't it? How do we fix CA? How do we get them to listen? Criticism hasn't had the broad scope appeal to push change. Anger and rage hasn't had the scale to impact their bottom line enough to shift approaches." And you can blame the shows for this, to an extent, surely. Most people looking at influencers like yourself or Arch would simply typecast you and ignore it. They are absolutely tone deaf. Largely negative Steam reviews no longer have any impact, as CA will cry to Steam and they will get them to delete reviews they deem invalid. Steam has some control over those requests, so it's not all CA's way, but CA will 100% invest a resource, some poor shit in the community team, to come up with a list of invalid Steam reviews and process them to be removed. Although I would add, I heard a lot that CA is absolutely shit scared of bad reviews. That's a recurring theme that I heard. So even though there's the caveat here that CA have tools that they can use to minimise the effect of negative Steam reviews, especially big review bomb events, they still care a lot about Steam reviews. The impression I got is that it was like their kryptonite. If people leave bad reviews, it really bothers them. It bothers them a lot. Julius went on though, "I don't think we'll see large-scale, open and honest change with CA until the community as a whole comes together and realises what a poor state of affairs the company is in. Rally behind the shared love and appreciation of what Total War was and how it has strayed. I appreciate it's not a path that's likely to happen, but imagine how impactful it might be to have a staunch ally of CA suddenly turn against them, with criticism. Quite possibly apathy might end up being the best path. Clearly they don't want to listen or change. They're a corporate machine who will always throw out boilerplate nonsense to try and dismiss the majority of the current drama. Perhaps if we learn to not care, but to openly show that, perhaps they might witness a drop-off in purchases. Again, that's not exactly an easy path to convince people to follow." And I should mention that this part was written to me before Pharaoh launched, because it seems like apathy towards Pharaoh has been unprecedented. So there's new context that might have changed what Julius would have said in regards to this. This might actually be the best way forward, bearing in mind Pharaoh. But Julius went on, and this is the final paragraph of a very thorough answer. "Exposé. perhaps bring attention to the fact that the brand team drives the concept of a game. They have presentation decks that they refer to as the Bible for that specific game that drive the whole life cycle of the product. They're used in pitches to Sega to secure funding. 9 out of 10 times, if there's a bad decision made that's received poorly by the community, it's driven by a marketing strategy. Intel modes in Warhammer, exclusive contracts with Epic, DLC price increases. I heard sentiments like these from pretty much everyone willing to talk to me. So here is yet another ex-CA that can explicitly confirm this. Let's call them Scipio. One thing though that I can definitely confirm is that brand managers were completely running the show when I was there. They had too much decision power, and that was recognised also by other members at CA, to the point that there were often issues and conflicts in the brand team. At the same time as all this was happening, I started talking to another CA employee. We call this one Brutus. When I pasted to Brutus some of the descriptions of the brand department, Brutus said this: "It's a classic scenario of a game with a devoted following that has abused its fanbase. In company meetings, Rob Bartholomew used to present us with these charts illustrating game sales and how they compare to one another. The total sales of tentpole releases don't fluctuate much, so the key to boosting profits is to raise the average spend per player. Personally, I don't think DLC is inherently problematic, but it often feels like Total War DLC has become a rather cynical method of achieving this goal at this point." And I also asked them this, and this was likewise before Pharaoh's launch. So I asked Brutus this. Something I usually ask ex-CA when they get in contact is to just give me their own idea of what's actually going wrong that ought not be. What's causing, for example, Pharaoh to be apparently a Troy reskin, which is a Warhammer mod, which is fundamentally a close derivative of Attila's codebase, so I've heard. Why aren't we getting regular engine upgrades that bring the games forward like we used to? What's in the way of real progress and improvement? And then of course Pharaoh launched and it was just a Troy reskin, so that question aged really well. And Brutus answered, "It's true Warhammer is a derivative of Attila's codebase. Historically that's been the case for every game, i.e. it sort of branches off the codebase of another project. With several Total War games in the works at once, it's like playing a game of codebase Tetris. This way of working has meant that each game is in essence a fork of another. There isn't much separation between engine and game. In recent years they've been trying to tease out an engine from the codebase, but as far as I know, they haven't got very far yet." And then Brutus went on, "The major problem with Total War, as I see it, is that CA hasn't invested enough time in the engine and tools, so it's clunky as hell to work with, so implementing anything is more cumbersome than it should be, and that's going to make it less likely that people will try big changes. To be fair, most in-house engines are like this to a degree. It's not the worst I've seen, but the poor tools comes up in every post-mortem, and they always say they'll do something about it really this time." And of course, this perfectly echoes what Augustus told me a year ago. Brutus went on though, to further answer my question about what's going on there and what's wrong. "Another problem is, how to put this, there are plenty of great people at CA, but there are some people who are deeply mediocre. Some of them have been there for literally decades and reaching high positions. I don't know if they genuinely don't realise they're useless or just don't have the courage to get rid of them. Sometimes they shuffle from one position to another and then management feels like that's dealing with their problem." And I should mention, this is once again before Pharaoh launched, I was told what you're about to hear. Because Brutus went on and said, "For Total War though, one thing I'll say, and you probably don't want to hear this, is that it consistently makes good money. It's a dependable income stream for the company. The last I heard was that they tend to do 2 to 3 million in sales, which is nothing compared to the big blockbusters, but it is respectable. Before Hyenas, I was told that CA was Sega's most profitable studio because of this. It's relatively niche while being very profitable, probably too niche for anyone to have much incentive to try to compete, and also means they don't have much incentive to change the formula much or do things too differently." And because my interest was so piqued by the concordance with what I'd already heard from Augustus from the start, of Augustus I said the following: "They said there is immense tech debt that really slows down the progress and work, that the code is creaking at the seams. They also said there's loads of complaining about cleaning some of it up and they always get a soon, and that soon never comes, just on to the next project. It's uncanny how much what I was told then echoes what you're describing right now, so hearing you say that is a perfect corroboration of some of the most actionable criticism I've heard." And Brutus replied, Immense tech debt and code creaking at the seams is exactly right. I keep thinking it's going to reach a point of critical mass, but I'm still waiting. On Total War there are the game teams, and then there's a couple of non-game teams like tools and rendering, but they're seen as being an emergency resource or something. Inevitably every game gets busy towards the end, so people from these other teams get pulled in to help out. With all these projects on the go, there's almost always one of them that needs extra help. From what I hear, that's exactly what happens with the team tasked with clearing up the engine too. So CES says they'll deal with the tech debt and tools after every game, even setting up a team to ostensibly do that, but then doesn't actually use them to do that job most of the time. And then Brutus continued, and this was really interesting. Oh, and another problem with Total War, matched combat. I imagine you already know as it's been publicly spoken about, but it's where battle animations have an attacker animation and a defender animation, so soldiers get kinda paired up to fight. It can look good, but if you ask me, it's too much of animations driving the actual combat mechanics. I believe this is why Rome 1 combat felt so different, kinda more free and less constrained, if that makes sense. And this is really interesting, especially to hear this directly from a CA developer, because this is one of those things that people can easily fall on either side of. And I've always credited Rome 1 as looking so good and having such good combat for the reasons he says here, but at the same time, Shogun 2 managed to make those matched combat animations work, kinda. And of course, every single time after that, they've just basically been shit. Like Rome 2, they were terrible and looked horrible. The only time these matched combat animations have worked, in terms of the gameplay, arguably, is Shogun 2. And of course, they've just been appropriated to make Warhammer sell. Like, that's it. It's just about... It's like they were just laying the groundwork for Warhammer with all the monsters to fight each other. That's what it seems like at this point. It seems to me like the match combat animations are just a marketing gimmick at this point. I'd be curious what CA developers think of that aspect. Could be another part of the games that's driven by the brand and the marketing, and not the gameplay. So in response to all of what Brutus just said, I commented the following. CA sounds like an extremely mismanaged studio that's complacently on its golden goose, that it's really at risk of killing with its protracted negligence. And Brutus responded, complacently on its golden goose, exactly, all it takes is for them to have some competition and they'd be in utter chaos. And this fits with what I had also heard from Julius earlier, when Julius said, honestly, their biggest rival was always Paradox. They were shitting themselves hoping they wouldn't step into the real-time battles arena, because they had them beat on campaign turn-based. For 3K, they actively tried to copy elements from their games to make things like diplomacy more engaging. If Paradox could just step up and do real-time, I'm sure a lot of Total War fans would jump over. And then Julius also said, CA need a rival to challenge them enough to wake the fuck up. And that was really telling. Back to Brutus though. I explained my gratitude at the descriptions of the tech debt, pointing out that I'd heard similar things before and this was clearly a crucial problem. So Brutus elaborated even further. I believe that inadequate tools and creaky codebase are the main problem with Total War. It was a significant concern when I started, and that was 10 years ago. Things have only deteriorated since. The amount of tech debt means that the games are increasingly brittle, the code is difficult to navigate, which slows development down, and performance is pretty bad for what it is. Each game being a fork of a previous one means that most of the features are just modified versions of existing ones. It's a slow evolution where each game is rarely radically different from the one before, or really brings something fresh. I think this is one of the reasons the game has stagnated, and CA should consider cutting back to the game's core foundations if they ever hope to recapture the essence that made the old games so special. Whew. By this point, I've made several videos showing anonymous statements from Creative Assembly developers. One of the developers that got in touch with me very recently, called Marcus Aurelius, had the following to say. Marcus, the situation at CA was not caused by malice or malpractice. It was caused by short-term thinking, corporate overreach, and a disconnection from the fans. Top-level decisions were always made to make profitability look good this year at the expense of what would happen in 5 years. The can was always kicked down the road, and now that it's 5 years later, we are finding out what happens when that is done too often. Costs kept increasing with extra buildings, social justice initiatives, new employees that didn't work directly on the games, and numerous other things. Eventually the revenue the projects brought in couldn't cover these costs, and so something had to give. especially after Hyenas was cancelled. The saddest thing was that the fans kept telling us what they wanted, but we always seemed to do anything but that, and I have no idea why. And I can only assume that this is in reference to Medieval 3, or potentially an Empire 2, probably a Medieval 3. I had also quoted some of the original tech debt descriptions of Augustus to Marcus, and in response to those, Marcus clarified with this. The Total War engine doesn't have tech debt. It is tech debt. Whenever any effort is put into making improvements to the engine for the long term, anyone working on that gets pulled back onto the next shipping product to make short-term hacks to get it to hit its deadlines. Warhammer 1 was based on the Rome 2 engine. Then it had to cope with 2 sequels, 2 new PC storefronts, Epic and Microsoft, that have multiplayer crossplay with Steam, a new live services backend, and Immortal Empires that somehow combines all 3 games in one. It is a miracle the whole thing works at all, and is a testament to the skill and persistence of the Total War programmers that keep the whole show on the road. Warhammer 3 now limps on with all this legacy, making any updates, new content, or bug fixes extremely difficult to produce. And I'm reminded when I read this of how us, the players that play the game, and the people that are actually working on making these games, the software engineers, the coders, the people that are actually in the thick of it, up to their knees in the mud of shit code, we are all in the same team. They're doing their best, and we want them to do their best. They're just not allowed to do their best, and you can see that right here. I'm reminded of Julian McKinley, who was put in front of the camera to talk about the Rome 2 AI that he was working on. Him and all the people working with him weren't even allowed to make a working Rome 2 AI on launch. He was basically scapegoated. His reputation was put on the line, and he took so much abuse for that, as I've learned. To this day, if you ask people who would you blame for the Rome 2 AI being shit on launch, a lot of people would blame the people that are doing their best, doing everything to keep it from being even worse than it already was. It's just a completely perverted narrative that's only possible because the people in power make all the decisions and can easily just pull the wool over people's eyes. The truth is always so much more nuanced. And I should say, I can only share these posts because Creative Assembly workers came to me and did it together. If I only ever had, say, one person come to me with Hyenas information, or one person come to me about Total War ever, then it doesn't really matter how good their descriptions are. I can't cross-reference what they say with anyone else's, and even if I can confirm it by some other means, I can't really do anything with it for fear of identifying the person telling me. All I have is one person telling me interesting stuff, but when I have 2, or 5, or 20 CA employees all saying the same things, then that is totally different. If I had to sum up all of the problems at CA after all of these conversations, it really would probably be my own developed version of those original 3 bullet points I summarised of what Augustus told me with. 1, there's a staff problem. People leave if they're competent and stay on if they're not, especially at higher levels. Something like the Dilbert principle or the Peter principle has to be happening here. I'm reminded of something else Scipio said that I haven't quoted yet. I think as a company, CA has always been afraid to let go of people because they are a people company, whatever the fuck that means. And they also overhired during COVID, and now they are suffering the consequences with layoffs. Actually, I think these layoffs may be one of the pieces that could really change how things work at the company. That, and also a complete restructuring of leadership. I mean, people should go and be replaced. And up until now, people haven't been going and being replaced. It sounds to me like the company is stagnating, just like the engine is. A lot of large companies limit the terms of their CEOs and directors and other high position executives to periods of 7 or so years. CA might be a good example of why that's usually done. It's like CA needs its own term limits. People can't reliably operate at the highest levels of performance at these corporate structures and these important positions for these extended periods of time. It's just not normal. It's not in human nature to do this. Further to this, I've heard so much complaining about specific people at CA that I can name for being shit. Not horrible people like Rob apparently is, but just shit. Just not good for the games. Bad for Total War. It's hard to doubt that these people are making all this stuff up when, once again, there's concordance of testimony. People unprompted that just come out with the same stuff and they all just lead to the same places. It sounds to me like people feel held back a lot by their superiors. It's sad in a way. I get a picture of people working really hard and wanting the best for the games and just being resigned and defeated because they can't make a difference, demoralised. It reminds me of what I heard about Hyenas, come to think of it. And I should mention, I see this complained about in Glassdoor reviews too. You can see this for yourself on Glassdoor. And the second bullet point, C has organised itself so that the money men run the show. The people trying to actually design good games are relegated beneath the greedy, soulless marketers and brand-obsessed weirdos. I quote from anonymous CA developers all of the following. They care about one thing, and that's money. And by they, I mean CA brand. They promote within the people who work to make them money. I suppose now would be a good time to mention that everyone that talked about Rob Bartholomew only had negative things to say about him. For example, the absolute evil is Rob Bartholomew. And then again, Rob Bartholomew I never had to deal with personally, but I've heard him described as a complete sociopath. And then when I quoted both of these together to someone else, I have never spoken directly to Rob, so I only heard stories. He was definitely influential, but I can't add much other than what's already been shared. So not exactly running to his defence. I've seen a few other ex-CA make jokes along the same lines, so it seems well confirmed. It's safe to say at this point, Legend and the subreddit are totally right, I think. Fuck Rob, and fuck the brand department.
I say we take off and nuke the entire site from orbit. It's the only way to be sure.
Fucking A.
Anyway, these brand and marketing people steering the development of the games. It is why these games are, as I've been saying for years, DLC pipelines. I was describing what I saw after they had shipped. Now I've been told that's exactly what they were by design from the concept stage. The whole point of these games is to sell DLC straight from the horse's mouth, as if it wasn't obvious enough from 3K being binned when it wouldn't sell DLC, and Thrones of Britannia being binned when it had a fucked launch and was never going to sell DLC. Now you know, straight from the horse's mouth. And you might also think it's why these games are so shit. Just think about it. It could be that they're so shit on purpose, so you're unsatisfied and buy DLC to fill the hole deep inside you. It's time to give Admiral Price some credit. It almost seems like he knew something, or someone told him something years ago. And finally, and this is the biggest one I think, bullet point number 3, tech debt. It's always more immediately financially prudent to sacrifice long-term productivity for short-term profit. Reynolds Santi actually described this vividly a decade ago.
And the new Warscape engine has its merits, but they just don't make up for what they've lost. Rome 1 was a rickety, ugly stone bridge, but you could cross the river with it. Warscape is a log floating in the river, tied hastily into position with ropes. It can't take anywhere near as much weight as the bridge, it bounces around with the current, and it has a shitty tendency to sink into the water when you step on it. And after 4 years, the developers have tied so many extra ropes to it to try and make it sturdy that they may as well have just built a bridge in the first fucking place.
Now it's been confirmed extensively over and over again, and now we know just how deeply rooted this problem is. So what conclusions can we draw from all of this so far? All this stuff that I've heard and organised neatly for you, what conclusions can we get from all of this? You can make your own, but I've got some of my own that I think are interesting. 1, there's just no point caring about Total War games for absolutely fucking years, because that's how long it would take to fix the biggest problems that have been in the way this whole time. Only when these problems are acknowledged and there's evidence they're being addressed can the timer even start. The tech debt is the obvious one. The codebase has to be worked on for like 2 years or more to get it fixed so they can start using it properly, because they're not using it properly right now. So until they come out and say they're doing this, we have no reason to think that they are. And we have every reason to think this problem is just going to get worse and worse, and the games are likewise going to suffer. Conclusion number 2, there's a real possibility that the best thing that can happen is Creative Assembly dies, and someone else takes over as soon as possible. There's too much complacency while they milk this golden goose for all it's worth. They have a devoted fan base and they're happy to exploit it. People will keep buying the garbage, so they'll keep making the bare minimum of garbage. Also, it's recently been openly acknowledged by ex-CA on camera that they think their customers are basically just whales to be milked. They have no respect for them.
I generally believe that CA has a little bit of a cultural problem when it comes to interacting with the community, and it also is present internally, where people don't necessarily show the necessary respect to customers. both when it comes to just people on in online discourses. So whether that be Reddit or YouTube comments or whatever, I don't think that CA's employees, even not just the leadership necessarily, I don't think people show enough respect to the customers that essentially fund their lifestyle.
And finally, for point number 3, there's only one thing to be done about Rob Bartholomew and his brand department.
Say we take off, nuke the site from orbit. It's the only way to be sure. Let's do it.
CA doesn't have a counterintelligence department conducting psyops and spreading misinformation, which would have made this video a pain in the arse to make. Not yet anyway. I don't want to give Rob ideas, but a counterintelligence department is probably the next step over there at CA. They do anything to avoid making good games, so it won't be long before that's up and running and protecting that bottom line, so they can just keep not making good games for yet another decade. I'd like to thank everyone for the trust. I got the impression from a lot of people talking to me that they didn't have much choice when it came to YouTubers that they could talk to about this stuff. One of them even told me straight that there just isn't anyone else they could go to. There's no one. Consistency is a really big problem for Total War YouTubers, thanks to, as one ex-CA describes to me, Gestapo-like social engineering that's now been underway for over a decade, and they've gotten good at it. All you have to do is listen to Legend of Total War describing how manipulated he feels in streams that he's been doing recently, and it's really obvious.
Funny thing is, when Warhammer 3 was in development, they crossed out feedback, some creators. Your comments were usually redacted. Yours was mostly crossed out. That completely flies in the face of what Creative Assembly told me during early access. They just wanted me there to market the game, and that's not what I wanted. So they 100% lied.
I've made it obvious that I've completely burned all bridges, so anyone can see I'm forever immune to all that shite. It's sad because these developers clearly have always wanted to speak about these things. It's like therapy to some of them to get this shit off their chest, and so many YouTubers have decided to take the low road of assimilation and appropriation, actually just completely fallen for all of the cheap tricks. They're basically an extension of CA themselves at this point. As a YouTuber with your own channel, your independence is the most valuable thing you have. If that wasn't obvious before, then it surely is now. They just forfeited their autonomy for useless roles on Discord servers and free keys to increasingly shitty games that I'm sure a lot of them barely even use anymore. They make the decision every day to continue to give away their independence, completely fucking worthless. I've never been more proud that I didn't make it through even one whole game release cycle as someone with any affiliation with CA. I joined the content creator program at the end of 3K, naively thinking things had got better from the Rome 2 days, and I left the content creator program at the very start of Troy, the moment I realised it hadn't gotten better, or rather, I was manually removed with an excuse made up, and a lot of people have noticed that. I wear it like a badge. One notable exception to the Great Shilling operation that I have to point out is Legend of Total War, who was the only high-profile Total War YouTuber to take a stance against the fraudulent DMCA CA filed against me, and that I'm still absolutely fucking furious about, by the way. And I noticed recently that he had ex-CA staff appearing in his livestream spilling dirt. I hope more ex-CA just randomly turn up to say hi in Legend stream chat going forward. Ironically, CA filing bullshit DMCA notices against me just lended me credibility and made even more employees tip over the edge and decide to message me. There was a burst when they did that. One of them even told me that was the last straw for them and made up their mind for them. So yeah, I've always made it clear where I stand. It's about time other YouTubers did the same thing. I think a line has been drawn at the sand at this point. If you've been inconsistent up until now, nothing can change that, and you'll have to deal with getting shat on and mocked about it forever, at least on some level, to some extent. You should expect that. If that's the case, you can resolve to get things right from now on. You can just stop being, as I once said, a Stockholm syndromed battered wife shill. That's the one thing you can always do at any time. Resolve to stop being a fucking useless bastard.
If the rule you followed brought you to this, of what use was the rule?
I suppose this is a great opportunity to say that if you, the viewers, ever wanted to ask CA developers a question about Total War and get a non-bullshit, non-corporate, non-marketing, non-PR answer, do it in the comments section of this video. Upvote the ones you like, and if your question is good, I'll do what I can to forward it to the appropriate department. My email address is in the description, if anyone has anything they want to tell me, as well. This was one of my hardest ever videos to make. A lot of work and thought went into this one, but it was worth it. Thanks everyone for watching. More to come. I've been told the development environment of Alien Isolation was an even bigger bin fire than Hyenas was. But that's a story for another time. If you think what I do has value and you want to support it, then check my Patreon page out. I do my best to give out perks, which include monthly updates on what I've got planned and what I'm thinking about, my scheming. Special thanks to Matteo Olivetti, Nerdington Paints, SJ Mage, Bador Nasser, and Desync was here.